High up in the mountains of Africa lies one of the continent's most intriguing nations. In many ways, it's almost the complete opposite of what you might stereotypically associate with African countries. It's cold, it has abundant water, and it's entirely surrounded by another nation. But don't be fooled into thinking all is well here. When you look just beneath the surface, you'll find a land of instability, hunger, and an astonishing level of death, even when compared to its peers. It might just be Africa's greatest mystery, the diamond of the mountains with a dark secret to match. Welcome to the Kingdom of Lesotho. So, what do you need to know about Lesotho? Well, it's a landlocked country entirely surrounded by the Republic of South Africa, located in the east-central part of that nation. Slightly larger than Maryland and slightly smaller than Belgium, Lesotho exists among the clouds, thousands of meters above sea level. In the west, the altitude varies from 1,500 to 1,800 meters above sea level. This is the country's main agricultural zone and contains most of the population, as well as its capital, Maseru. The rest of the country is composed of highlands that rise to 3,474 meters in the Drakensberg Range, which forms the eastern boundary with KwaZulu-Natal. The highest peak in southern Africa is located just inside Lesotho's eastern border. Due to the elevation, southern latitude, and high winds, it's actually one of the coldest parts of Africa. The average temperature, 18 degrees Celsius in the summer, and in the winter it's a little above 6 degrees. The resources are still scarce, a consequence of both the harsh environment of the highland plateau and the lack of agricultural space in the arid lowlands. In the highlands, most villages can only be reached on horseback, by foot, or by light aircraft. And it's also dry, with only 700 to 800 millimeters of precipitation per year. However, they still get a surprising amount of snow in winter due to the altitude, which, when it melts, feeds rivers and reservoirs, making the country one of the largest freshwater sources in the region. South Africa heavily subsidizes the nation due to its small economy, just $2 billion in GDP, with Lesotho's currency even pegged to the South African rand for stability. It's described as a lower middle-income country, with water and diamonds being its two largest industries. The Lesotho diamond is one of the largest ever discovered, and its water is sold to South Africa through the Lesotho Highlands Water Project. Its main languages are English and Southern Sotho, a Bantu language, and its main ethnic group, comprising over 99% of the population, is called the Basotho. It is 80% Christian, the majority of whom are Roman Catholic, with the rest of the population adhering to Islam, Hinduism, and other indigenous beliefs. It shares many historical commonalities with other African nations, particularly colonialism and instability. In the 1820s, it was known as Basutoland, founded by King Moshoeshoe I, who united various groups in the region to repel changes from the Zulus. It became a British protectorate and then a British colony in 1884, following a revolt against Cape colonial rule, retaining a large amount of autonomy. This history is why English remains one of the main languages today. In the Second World War, 20,000 Sotho served in the British Armed Forces fighting in North Africa, the Middle East, and Italy. Most served in the African Pioneer Corps. By the 1950s, the British Empire was waning, and as political parties emerged in the nation, there was a push toward total independence, which came in 1966 in the form of a parliamentary democracy and a constitutional monarchy. King Moshoeshoe II was the sovereign, and Chief Labour Jonathan from the Basotho National Party served as Prime Minister. But unfortunately, Lesotho would fall foul of many post-colonial issues. From the mid-1980s onwards, it faced coups, infighting between military factions, and major instability, especially since the 1990s. The 2000s and 2010s were largely characterized by politicians resigning, going into exile, threats of being overthrown, and severe droughts across the nation, endangering the people with famine. As of 2022, the country is under the rule of Sam Matekane and the Revolution for Prosperity Party, formed only 7 months before Matekane was elected Prime Minister. Matekane himself was a diamond magnate who turned to politics, basing his campaign on ending the instability that has plagued the nation since it gained independence. He also aimed to turn around the nation's economy, which is less than half the size of neighboring Eswatini's, as well as depoliticizing the armed forces across the nation. The king today is Moshoeshoe II's son, Letsi III. Now, everything we've told you so far about Lesotho might lead you to believe it's much like any other African country. From its geography to its economy to its history, nothing seems to stand out from the norm. But Lesotho holds a dark secret. Peering just beneath the surface, you will find a nation with one of, if not the, lowest life expectancies on Earth. And the big question is, what makes Lesotho such a deadly place to live? So, why does Lesotho have one of the lowest life expectancies in the world? As of 2024, the average life expectancy at birth in Lesotho is just 53, although some estimates put it as high as 57, which is still low. According to the UN, the life expectancy for 15-year-olds in Lesotho is an additional 47 years. For boys, specifically, it's 44 years, placing it dead last in the entire world. But what combination of factors is contributing to such a staggering statistic? Now, at first glance, it might be confusing to understand how this conclusion was reached. Take poverty, for example. The poverty rate in Lesotho is very high, with over 90% of the population living on less than $10 per day as of 2017. But that's not different from many countries in Africa and across the global south, and indeed, many countries poorer than Lesotho have a higher life expectancy. Similarly, its corruption rate is about average globally, and it doesn't seem out of place. Sure, just like poverty, it could be a lot better, but that's not driving the life expectancy down to among the worst in the world. As such a small country, there isn't much land that can be used for agriculture. The nation is food insecure and malnutrition is commonplace. With its arid climate, not much can grow, and due to poverty, both food and water are hard to come by in many areas. But even this is similarly true in many nations across Africa, and many of them still have a higher life expectancy. And we could go on discussing the political instability, the stagnant economy, low productivity, police brutality, human rights abuses, so on and so forth. But none of these factors are significantly different from those in neighboring countries, and yet Lesotho's life expectancy is still so low. So what is it? What is the elephant in the room that is being ignored here? People in Lesotho don't just die sooner than others for no reason, do they? Well, the answer isn't actually being ignored at all. In fact, it's very well known in this part of the world. It's just incredibly hard to do anything about. It's AIDS.
The AIDS virus
had AIDS.
AIDS is not
for evidence of exposure to AIDS.
In Lesotho, the prevalence of HIV and AIDS is at epidemic levels across the country. While authorities are starting to get a grip on it nowadays, it has devastated the nation's life expectancy. HIV/AIDS is the #1 cause of death for women in Lesotho. For men, it's tuberculosis, with AIDS as a close second. However, TB can only take such a toll because HIV weakens the immune system. Many people worldwide carry a latent strain of tuberculosis, but it's generally harmless because the body can fend it off. When a person contracts HIV, the body can't fight TB anymore. As a result, TB is the leading cause of death for people with AIDS. Both infections exacerbate each other, so the co-infection brought on by the prevalence of HIV in Lesotho is actually responsible for the first and second leading causes of death in the nation. And it's widespread. In 2014, the NIH estimated the HIV prevalence rate among 15 to 49-year-olds at 24.6%, with 37.6% of households in Lesotho directly affected by HIV. There are more infections per 100,000 people than in most other countries, including neighboring Namibia, Botswana, and Eswatini. There are many factors at play that explain why Lesotho in particular suffers from HIV and AIDS to such an extent. The first thing to point out is that it's not just a local issue. Eswatini, South Africa, Botswana, Namibia, Zambia, and Zimbabwe all struggle with very high rates of HIV. Such an epidemic is not confined to Lesotho, and many of the aggravating factors are not unique to it either. However, we'll get into why it has been an ideal breeding ground for the disease until relatively recently. To begin with, it's impossible to discuss HIV without addressing its primary mode of transmission, which is mostly through unprotected sex. Sharing contaminated needles and mother-to-child transmission are also factors, but sexual transmission, that's the main driver. And now we need to dispel a common myth. In Lesotho, there are cultural practices of having multiple sexual partners simultaneously, even post-marriage. While it may be assumed that this helps the virus spread, research indicates that other factors matter far more. There isn't a higher rate of HIV in areas with more non-monogamous people. Much more important are things like contraceptive use, which across Lesotho is quite low. Another key factor is that sex education across the country has only seen an increase in recent years. An overwhelming majority of the schools in Lesotho are managed by churches, which means that often people are practicing unsafe sex without even knowing that they're doing anything wrong simply because they're not being taught about it. And then we need to address a very serious matter: the gender-based violence that perpetuates the spread of HIV in Lesotho. Lesotho is a highly patriarchal society, as is common in southern Africa, and violence against women, especially intimate violence, is common. The UN reported in 2023 that 86% of Lesotho women and girls have experienced gender-based violence at some stage in their lives. Lesotho is reported as having the third highest rate of gender-based violence in the world. One documentary on the world's toughest prisons asserted that half the inmates at Maseru Central Prison were there for such crimes. And it remains a significant obstacle in Lesotho's battle against the disease. Due to the way women are treated, unequal power dynamics in relationships, often between younger women and older men, women are often prevented from pursuing HIV-preventable behaviors like practicing safe sex, which further spreads HIV. This is why more women have HIV than men in Lesotho, and when you combine this with the lack of contraception, children can be born with it. But why then? If these factors are pretty similar across many of Lesotho's neighbours, is Lesotho most affected by the drop in life expectancy? And the answer to that is geography. The nations surrounding Lesotho are better connected and have more healthcare facilities. Lesotho's harsh terrain and rural isolation make it harder to combat HIV in remote communities. Remember that TB is the leading cause of death for those with AIDS. Being unable to access healthcare in isolated communities, especially in wintertime, impacts TB deaths as much as AIDS deaths. In other countries, the flatter landscape makes healthcare more accessible to combat HIV and TB sooner in their infection cycles. Add to that the malnutrition, poverty, and food insecurity, and you have a recipe for people dying younger than they should. And we may have painted a grim picture of Lesotho, but that's not our intention today. Things are genuinely improving in relation to AIDS and TB across the country. They are much better than they were in the early 2000s when life expectancy was even lower. But it shows there's still a long way for this nation to go. Lesotho is at something of a crossroads when it comes to the future. There are reasons to be cautiously optimistic. The number of 15 to 49-year-olds with HIV reduced from 24.1% in 2015 to 19.3% in 2022, despite several hundred thousand people being added to the population during that time. According to UNAIDS, significant progress has been made toward reaching the 95-95-95 targets for AIDS in the country. That's 95% of people with HIV knowing their status, 95% of those receiving treatment, and 95% of those having suppressed viral load. With this kind of progress, the eradication of new HIV infections in the nation by 2030 is possible. AIDS-related deaths are also on the decline, and since 2010, new HIV infections are down 74%. These are all encouraging metrics indicating a system that is working to push HIV out of Lesotho society for good, eventually. Other indicators also show a cautiously positive upward trajectory. From an economic standpoint, inflation is easing, and the IMF predicts Lesotho's GDP will continue to grow in the near term. A strong economy will help combat the issues with HIV, as it's proven that widespread poverty increases the risk of contracting the disease. Water royalties have started to roll in from the Highlands Water Project, which sells water to South Africa. Lesotho is in a strong position to then turn that income into a positive for the whole nation. But a solid foundation is key, and those within the government are looking to amend their constitution to strengthen the nation against its biggest opponent since the country was founded: instability. If it can keep the economy growing, improve the quality of life for its citizens, and structurally reform its institutions to be less prone to political instability, poverty will reduce. Jobs will be created, food will become less scarce, and technology and transportation to assist the nation will become more widespread, as will healthcare and education. This will further reduce the prevalence of HIV and TB. Combining all that, you'd expect life expectancy overall to increase. But they need to not squander the opportunity. Real per capita incomes have shrunk by 10% since 2016, and unemployment and inequality remain high. There is social unrest among citizens who feel they've been left behind, and many still don't have basic necessities. People are still dying every single day. The aim to stabilize the nation politically is a huge undertaking that could lead it to more problems than it solves if not done right. It's vital to use the additional income the country has started to receive to lift the nation as a whole and ensure the money isn't wasted. But that's much easier said than done, especially with climate change starting to affect things. It's going to be an uphill battle to ensure that the nation is food secure and agriculturally productive, both things that will ease the squeeze on the citizenry significantly. Overall, Lesotho could go either way, into relative prosperity despite its small size, or it could fall back into instability, with economic inequality persisting and life expectancy not rising much in the grand scheme. There's no way of knowing for sure how things will pan out, but Lesotho has a stronger prospect for the future than many nations its size and on its continent. It faces significant challenges, but in overcoming them, it could become just like the diamonds it exports, honed under pressure into something beautiful.